What's up everybody? Welcome to my first little DIY here. So today I'm going to be doing something that I've wanted to do for a while now to my car. I'm going to be converting my power steering hydraulic rack and pinion over to a completely manual rack and pinion. So I'm getting rid of power steering, the whole power steering system, everything like that. Okay, before I start tearing this rack and pinion apart and converting it over to a manual rack, I do want to go over kind of like the backstory, why I am deciding to go about it this way. So mainly, I've been dealing with power steering issues since I've had this car, just little things here and there, leaks and replacing pumps and everything like that. So at this point, I'm kind of over just having power steering. It's not the biggest deal to me. Like, it's a front wheel drive and the car's light enough where it honestly doesn't matter to me. With this car, I want to go like very bare minimum, very responsive, and I want a lot of feedback from this car. So with steering, manual racks are really going to be the most responsive and the most feedback you can ever get out of a rack. So I know a lot of you guys are probably saying in your head, why don't you just loop the lines and everything like that? Well, right now I'm driving my car with looped lines, and there's still a little bit of like loss of feedback on the wheel just because there is still power steering fluid in the rack, and there's still some sort of like residual pressure built up in there that you are having to fight against, as opposed to actually driving a car with a actual manual rack. So if you were to sit in a car that has a manual rack compared to something that's a looped line, you'll feel the difference for sure. It's actually a little bit easier and more responsive driving something with a manual rack and pinion. So I really like the way that felt. I drove a car with a manual rack. I really like the way it felt. So my new rack just got delivered, so I'm gonna go ahead and just take that one apart and convert it over to a manual rack. So I'll show you guys that process here. Let's get it. Alright, so I'm gonna give you guys a little brief rundown on just the basics of power steering and how it works. So this right here is your rack and pinion, right? This is going to be like your input shaft. This is what's directly connected to your steering column. So from there, this is the actual pinion gear. There's a gear in there that looks kind of like a little corkscrew, and it's kind of in an angle. And then in here you have a rack gear, so it's just a flat surface with teeth on it. And then that pretty much just moves back and forth as this spins. You have your inner outer tie rods. These are what actually turn your wheels when they move in and out. So you have your rack and pinion, you have your reservoir, power steering pump, and that's pretty much the basics of it. You have a power steering pump that's driven by the belt that's pretty much building up hydraulic pressure. It's coming to these lines. You have a side for left, side for right. And what's going on is in here you actually have two chambers. You have a chamber in here, you have a chamber in there on this side, and inside there's this kind of like a ring that separates the right from left chamber. And what actually happens is there's a pin in here that when you turn, it decides what side is going to get the pressure. So let's just say I'm trying to turn left, which means it's going to be coming this way. It's going to build pressure on the left side of that chamber, build it so it assists you on turning while this chamber is being released. And that's like the basics of power steering, and let's get rid of it now.
Alright, I do apologize, but I will be voicing over the rest of this video just because I didn't realize while I was filming, but when I came to edit I noticed that all the audio was completely ruined. Something went wrong with the microphone I was using. I hope you guys don't mind. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do in taking this apart is let's get rid of the dust boots right here. First thing you want to start off with is actually taking off the little pin off the end, close to where the outer tie rods go. So the next thing you want to take off is this metal clip. You're pretty much going to want to mangle that off, cut it off, just because it's not going to be reused. You'll probably want to use zip ties. Once you get that off, you're just going to want to take that dust boot off that lip, and then you're going to expose the actual inner tie rod end and the way that goes together. So if you actually look closely at the inner tie rod end, you're gonna notice there's a little washer that's bent over where you actually put your wrench on. So you're gonna wanna get a wrench over the rack gear shaft itself, which is gonna be the shiny silver part. And then you wanna bend up those tabs from that skinny lock washer and get a wrench on the actual inner tie rod itself, and that's how you're gonna loosen everything. So if you look at this shiny silver shaft, that's the actual rack gear itself. So if you look at the end of it, you're gonna see these two tabs going in, and you'll see that it's actually threaded. That's where your inner tie rod threads in. Now, so you can get a closer look at the actual how the inner tie rod goes together. So you'll notice there's a big spacer, and under the big spacer there's that little washer, that lock washer. So that lock washer goes bent over the flat part on the inner tie rod, and if you see those two tabs actually lock in place on the shaft right there. So that's how it actually locks the inner tie rod from loosening all by itself. So right there you can see that's where you'll actually bend the washer over the flat surfaces on the inner tie rod. That's how that all goes together. After you get the inner tie rod off, the next thing you're going to want to do is actually take the outer sleeve off. So you're going to want to take these 4 12mm bolts off. You'll notice when you're taking these off, the last one, it's going to have some tension on it. It's going to want to be pushing out, so you really can't get it off with your hand for the most part. And you'll notice when you actually take that sleeve out, on the bottom of it there's going to be this weird like huge spring on there. So just be careful with that, just make sure you keep that safe. So the next thing I'm doing is actually taking off this whole entire line assembly. This is the place where all the lines actually go in. So you're just going to want to remove 2 10mm bolts. There's one up right there that you see, and there's one down there, right there. So these are fairly simple bolts to remove here. You'll pretty much just want to wiggle it off a little bit. And on the actual rack itself, you'll notice the 2 little ports, and that's where the left and right feed lines go to. And if you notice this little pin, that little pin has some free play on it. So that's what decides whether the hydraulic pressure is going to the right or to the left. So the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is take off this top cover off of where the input shaft goes. And these are 4 10mm bolts. So I'll go ahead and just remove those, and you'll notice that it'll just slide right up. And you'll notice the play in the input shaft, and that's directly because of the pin that decides what direction the hydraulic pressure is going to. So the next thing I went ahead and did was remove this snap ring off the bottom assembly. So that's the bottom of the pinion gear. Then you're going to go ahead and remove that top cover. So just remove it off the shaft. And then there's going to be another snap ring on the top that holds it all in place. You'll remove that as well. And you'll notice that the pinion gear can pretty much just drop down, and it slides right out. And there's your pinion gear. So you want to keep that very safe. That's a very important piece. I went ahead and removed the tensioning screw. So there's like a locking nut around it, and then the actual tensioning nut. Be careful when you take it off because there's a spring there. So I also went ahead and removed this inner sleeve, and I didn't go over it too much in the video, so I'll touch on it now. So if you look at this part here, that's the actual ring that separates the right from the left. So that's a very important part in a power steering rack and pinion. That blue gasket around it actually seals against that inner sleeve I just removed. So that piece is very important in a power steering hydraulic rack and pinion. However, with what I'm doing, I'm actually removing anything that has to do with the power steering. I'm turning it into a manual rack and pinion. So with me converting everything to a manual setup, I'm gonna be cutting that ring off. I didn't really get it in a video just because it's kind of difficult to do. I also went ahead and removed the other inner tie rod, so you can actually see that rack gear right there. You can see the teeth on there. And once you have that off, you could pretty much just slide it out this way, and there you go. Since I'm completely removing all of the power steering, which means I don't need any of the hard lines, so I don't need that huge hard line assembly, I went ahead and mocked this shape up, and the whole idea is I'm gonna be pretty much making like a block off plate. So I actually took that line assembly, I put it on the sheet metal, and I traced it out. So there's that shape that I have drawn on there. I'm gonna go ahead and cut that out so it can actually bolt up to the rack assembly itself. And along with doing this, if you notice that pin is sticking out pretty far, I'm actually gonna be drilling a hole to fit that pin through so it could eliminate the free play. Because by having that plate bolted on and having the pin stick through that plate, it's not gonna allow the pin to move back and forth, which will eliminate a lot of free play in the steering wheel. So once you remove that tensioning screw and spring, you can pretty much pop this little cylinder out. It's the tensioning cylinder, so you can see it has that curve, and the whole point of this is it pushes against the rack cylinder itself, and it pushes it and creates tension between the rack gear and the pinion gear. So that's a very, very important piece. And if you notice in the middle of it, there's a little hole, and you'll notice when you take it apart, there's gonna be a lot of grease in this. So when you reassemble it, you wanna make sure you put a lot of grease in that spring assembly and on that piston, because that grease feeds into that piston and it eliminates premature wear when it's rubbing up against that rack gear moving side to side. So now I have everything apart. You can kind of see all of the pieces here. If you look in the middle, you'll see that spring. So with everything apart, I pretty much went through and cleaned everything out. So now that we're ready for reassembly, I'm busting out this high temperature grease. And first thing we're gonna want to do is go ahead and just pretty much get the rack assembly, and let's start getting grease all over it. So you're gonna pretty much want to grease anything that is on the inside and anything that is going to be making contact with any moving parts. So there are bearings in there, there's going to be all the surfaces. You want to make sure you grease them up very generously. And when greasing the actual rack gear itself, make sure you get extra saucy with this. Make sure you are very generous with the grease on this gear in particular, just because this is going to be very, very important for the life of this rack and pinion. And definitely don't forget to work the shaft. And one more thing, make sure you're very generous with the grease on the underside of the rack gear itself, just because that's going to be the part that's rubbing up against that tensioning piston that I showed you guys earlier. Now you're going to want to make sure you grease up that direction selecting assembly. And then you'll go ahead and slide the actual rack gear in the same way it came out. Now I'm going to go ahead and grease the actual pinion gear. This is very, very important. I don't think I have to tell you that. So when you're putting the pinion gear in, you're gonna wanna just kind of put it in from the bottom. As you're pushing it up, you'll kind of notice it'll slide in and engage to the rack gear itself. So you'll feel it slide in. So you're gonna want to put the snap ring up on the top. What that's gonna do is hold that pin assembly in place, and so you'll still notice your pinion gear is kind of loose in there. I'm just gonna put that seal up in the top, just put it in place. And the next thing I'm gonna go ahead and do is put the snap ring down at the bottom. So now that that's all on, your rack gear and your pinion gear are in place. And I can't stress it enough, this tensioning piston is very, very important. Make sure you're very generous with the grease on this, especially on the surface that's making contact with the rack shaft itself. This is going to be a very, very important part of the rack and pinion. And I think it's even more important that I'm converting it to a manual rack and pinion. So if you do this, make sure you're very generous with the grease in this section. So the next thing is putting on this sleeve. So yeah, you're just gonna want to place that inner sleeve right there and just go ahead and push it in. Now before putting that outer black sleeve over everything, make sure you drop that spring in, very important. And then just go ahead and slide it on. And just go ahead and thread some bolts in. So now the most exciting part for me is putting the little block off plates on there. I'm gonna go ahead and just bolt this plate on. And I had to make some minor adjustments to the holes I drilled out because they didn't line up so well the first time. But here it is all bolted together, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about by sticking the pin through. So you can kind of see it holds that pin in place, so there's no free play in the input shaft whatsoever. So there's that block off plate, pretty happy with it. And everything is all together now. I just haven't tightened those inner tie rods, but I'll go ahead and do that when I'm going to install it. And another thing, there are exact specs on that tensioning bolt, but I don't know how that's going to vary with a manual rack and pinion, so I'm going to do some research on that. If anything, once this is installed in the car, that tensioning bolt is very easy to reach, so I think I'm going to install it and just kind of tighten it to where I think is good and feel it in the car. If it needs to be tighter or looser, I will adjust accordingly.
Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up here. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys did learn something new today, found anything useful. I hope you guys can put it to use. If you guys have any feedback, any questions, anything like that, just go ahead and comment. Also, just in case you guys were wondering, I'm going to go ahead and install that probably tomorrow or something. I'm going to drive it around for some time, maybe like a month or two. Then I'll drop another video just kind of going over my feedback, anything that I like, didn't like, and if it lasts. So we'll see. And I hope you guys can show me some support for some upcoming videos. I do have a lot more coming out, a lot more plans. So keep an eye out for that. Hit the subscribe button and see you guys in the next one. Peace.